Sir.
Good
Nice to
evening.
see you, AJ. It's a pleasure having you here. And good evening to our audience. Welcome to live chat. Our guest this evening is AJ Crabill, AJ Airwick Journey Crabill. He currently serves as conservator at DeSoto Independent School District, DeSoto, Texas. He is also a faculty member at the Leadership Institute of Nevada in Las Vegas, Nevada, and is National Director of Governance at the Council for Great City Schools. He previously served as board chair for Kansas City Public Schools, Kansas City, Missouri, and as Deputy Commissioner of Education for the Texas Education Agency. AJ was reared in and out of foster care beginning at birth. He bounced among 11 different schools before graduating from high school. He attended urban, suburban, rural, private, public, and parochial schools. He lived with white families and families of color. He lived in racist and inclusive communities, and he experienced loving homes and homelessness. AJ is guided by his belief that student outcomes do not change until adult behaviors change. He has devoted much of his adult life to advocating for the well being of our most vulnerable youth. Good evening, AJ. How are you this evening?
Good evening. Well, thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. I'm a little confused here. So, we're concerned with improving student outcomes. Wrap that up into governance coach, our title, if you would.
The first step that, and this will sound odd, but the first step that boards need to take to really position themselves to have a powerful impact on the students they serve is to simply acknowledge that the sole reason school systems exist is to improve student outcomes. Until boards accept and acknowledge that phenomenon, that the only reason school systems exist is to improve student outcomes, it will be difficult for them to be effective in the rest of their work.
Now, AJ, that's interesting because it implies that school districts do not see that as the primary or highest purpose or highest calling of a
It's not
school.
always in evidence, no.
Okay, what would be some of the things that would usurp student or improving student outcomes?
Well, in many parts of the country, school districts are the largest employer in the county, the largest uh, spender of tax revenue in the county, the largest um, purchaser of services in the county, often the largest food service organization in the county, sometimes the largest plant management organization in the county, and frequently the source of amazing Friday night lights. None of those, however, is the reason for which school systems exist. School systems exist for one reason only, and that's to improve student outcomes. And boards need to first fully commit without reservation that that is the sole purpose for which school systems exist, and everything else is expendable if it's not contributing to that intention.
Now, tell us how your experience as a foster child affects your thinking now and your work with schools.
Yeah, I was blessed, in that there were some really amazing public school educators who stepped into the gap when they didn't have to, but really made a difference in my life. Leaned in, to work with a angry and aggravating child that most other people had the good sense to give up on. But there are some who stood in the gap and said, "We're not going to give up on this kid."
Mhm.
Um, and I feel indebted by their persistence. That I have an obligation to be unwilling and unwavering when the temptation comes to give up on any of our children.
Mhm.
But that level of that level of kind of radicalism around believing that adults can make a difference if we're willing to set everything else aside really drives the work that I do today, largely because of my experience coming up as a child.
Well, I won't assume. So tell us, what is your why? Why do you get up in the morning?
Well, when I'm, being most candid, vengeance.
Go
There
on,
just
please, go on.
there are just so many folks who were very certain about what I could and could not do, what I wasn't not capable of, and what impact I could and could not make. Um, and every day I get to stand up and fight for children in public education across the nation. And that's the best form of revenge for the folks who refuse to believe in what was possible for me.
Hmm. Now, do you consider yourself an educator or a governance guru?
Uh, I, I, I self-identify as an educator. I came to this work, my first taste of it was getting to teach computer programming to middle schoolers. And uh, that experience of working with young people and really watching them, blossom and, find something that they were passionate about and excited about. Watching them go on into high school and college to study computer programming and to go on and to make that, career. That really spoke to me. Later on, when I uh, served as an interventionist with high schools, and when I led my own summer program for students, largely court-involved students, but that really was focused on reaching out to and investing in students that other people had given up on, and then showing that those people were wrong in their assessment of these students. Like those are the experiences that most guide and most inspire the work that I do today. And so it happens that the work I do today is mostly with adults,
Hmm.
but it certainly had this genesis and just a love for and engagement
Hmm.
with our students at the classroom level.
So you're called to be an educator, called to be involved in the business of education.
But that's what I feel most passionate about is as much as I do enjoy the governance work that I do and working with superintendents and school boards and their senior leadership teams. As much as I do enjoy that, it's actually my second passion.
Hmm.
Um, After working with particularly high schoolers in the high school setting to help them really live into the fullness of their potential.
Hmm. I think we might want to know a little bit more about conservator. What exactly is a conservator?
So in Texas law, conservator is a lot like what other states refer to as a receiver. And so when a school system has run into some challenges, in other states it may be placed into a receivership. In Texas, one of the intervention options is it may be placed into a conservatorship. And so I certainly serve as a conservator with DeSoto ISD. Go Eagles.
Great. Well, I think we are ready to jump into our topic for today. The topic is titled Governance Coach, but we're going to talk about improving student outcomes. Where shall we start, AJ?
Well, you kind of start at the beginning. Like once a board has, adopted this clarity of mind that we exist for one reason and one reason only as a school system, that's to improve student outcomes. Then from that point on, uh, the challenge is that any community, communities of hundreds of thousands or millions of people, like how do you know which student outcomes the school system should focus on? Surely there are hundreds, if not thousands, of candidates. And so the role of the school board in collaboration with their chief executive, the first step is to identify the specific goals about student outcomes that the school system is going to focus on. And while this sounds basic, David, I got to tell you, I run into a lot of school districts across the country where you ask the board, what goals have you adopted? What is it that you all say is your community's vision for what students should know and be able to do? And I get blank stares. And so, fortunately, the orthodoxy of school board governance in the United States is a failed doctrine. And so, a lot of what I spend my time and my colleagues spend our time doing is really supporting boards that really recognizing that the board has an obligation to represent the vision of the community regarding which student outcomes the school system is going to focus on. And it does that by identifying and adopting a set of goals that describe what they say the students should know and be able to do. What are the highest priority, highest leverage goals that the organization is going to pursue for the next 3 to 5 years?
Well,
That's step
AJ.
one.
Well, LJ, when a school district is in conservatorship, isn't there a detailed report, uh, clearly identifying the things that the district must do in order to get out of conservatorship?
Certainly. So that's one of the first things that I put in place when I joined DeSoto is identifying what are the criteria for success. The criteria let us know that this school system is really well positioned to serve children effectively going forward without any type of state involvement. And the four things that I identified after reading through the reports that were available before my appointment and from my one-on-ones with principals and senior staff and so on and so forth. Those are just these four key areas. And conveniently, in each of these areas, it was also easy to identify the district's current rating somewhere, in an A through F kind of format. Are they A, B, C, D, or F in this particular area? So I've identified four areas, and for each of them, identified what was the current rating for the district in that area. And then over a 2-year period, what rating do I feel we could get to?
Mm-hmm.
And so in the area of talent management, there was a audit that indicated there are 11 key practices that were not being pursued, and that those needed to be put in place. 0 out of 11 to me is 0%. I describe that as F performance in the area of talent, and we've changed that up just a little bit, but the conversation is basically the same. What percentage of our identified faculty are receiving the quality of mentoring and support that they need to continuously grow the quality of their instruction? We need to go from where we were at, where it wasn't really being tracked, so I described it as 0%, to somewhere north of 70%, at least a C. So when I arrived at the district, we were really in the F range. Today, we think that we're more in the D range,
Now
and
you
that
spoke
we're moving in the
about
right direction.
times there.
Pardon?
You mentioned some times there, 2 years and so on.
Mhm.
So in the case of a conservatorship, how many years would it be where you're
It's
helping to?
fairly common that it's a 2-year appointment. The idea is that let's try to figure out what we can do, get in and get out. This should not be a long-term, a long-lived thing. So that's
And,
why when I was identifying these four areas,
mhm.
talent management being the first one, that I was really looking at where can we get over from October of 2020 to October of 2022.
Okay. So those are like milestones, you might say, to keep
Hmm.
things moving forward. So then, even though there's a report, you still um, require that goals be set to improve student outcomes.
Well, certainly. So the ideal, so the other three areas. So the first was talent management. The
Hmm.
next was finance. The next is governance, and then those
Hmm.
three conspire to try to improve academics. And when
Right.
I arrived in October 2020, I identified as having a F in all four areas,
Hmm.
with the intention that ideally we'd have a C or better in all four areas as a
Hmm.
condition of my exit in October of 2022. And I think we're on a path that is very achievable. We're
Hmm.
definitely where we are as of October 2021. No Fs.
Hmm.
So clearly progress. So now the question is, can we accelerate and get to at least a C in all four of those indicators by
Hmm.
this coming August? And I think we're on track. It's good. Honestly, it'll be tight. It'll be really tight in a few areas, but we're on track. I think we can get it done.
Hmm. So then, after identifying goals, would aligning resources be the next step?
No. So once the board is identified, what are the things that we want our students to know and be able to do? What are the student outcomes that we want to focus the work of the school system on? The next
Right.
step is getting school boards really adept at monitoring progress. But this is for the same reason that schools have professional learning communities, is that you
Hmm.
want teachers to be constantly engaged in the process of planning out their instruction, delivering instruction, and then evaluating to figure out what worked, what didn't work, what did little AJ learn, what did little AJ not learn, what is our response to what he did or didn't learn, and then plan out our next round of instruction, and then wash, rinse, and repeat. And so that same exact phenomenon that you want to see happen in the classroom, you want to see something similar happening to that in the boardroom. I refer to that as monitoring progress. And so once the board has identified a set of goals, then it should every single month invest at least half of its time in monitoring progress relative to its goals for student outcomes.
Hmm. I'm, s- I'm still sort of confused here. Uh, if I'm going to take a simple example. If my goal is to go to the gym tomorrow morning, then I'm going to pack my gym bag tonight. So I've aligned my resources before I started to monitor my progress.
Hmm. Oh
Um,
yeah. So what I want them to have in place is a system for monitoring progress
uh-huh.
before they start to deploy resources. So before you put resources out there, we need to have a scoreboard to know what winning looks like. Because what
Okay,
happens is when you do it the other way around,
okay,
people will decide what resources to deploy and then come up with measurements to track the deployment of resources, not measurements to track the progress relative to the
right.
goals.
They'll put the cart in front of the horse, right, and let the tail wag the dog, so to
Yeah,
speak.
and so the actual monitoring of the progress takes
Right,
place all 12 months out of the year.
right,
But
right,
what I'm the first step is identify the goals. The second step is put the monitoring system in place, and then start aligning resources to your monitoring work. So that
okay,
as we're monitoring the implementation of something, if we need to make an adjustment,
right,
I mean, then let's make that adjustment. Let's make that pivot.
right.
The problem is if people do it the other way around,
Hmm.
they'll get super fired up about a program or a strategy, and
Right,
then they'll start monitoring, was that effective? Not, did this actually move the needle for children?
right.
And
I have seen
that is
that.
a very, very common
Yeah.
problem that I see school systems running into across the country, is that
Okay.
we get less focus on student outcomes and more focus on adult inputs. And so if adults tried really hard, then everybody's like, hey, we did it. We arrived. We did all the things that the adults said we were going to do, ergo, student outcomes. But that's not actually the case.
I have sat in many a progress meeting where the progress was how deeply something is implemented rather than how effective the outcome of the
Right.
implementation is. So
And
I
you
know
do need to
exactly what you mean.
do monitoring of implementation
Right.
to understand what is the quality of implementation that you're engaged in.
That's
But at the
important too.
governance level, but that is a management level task. That is
Right.
not a governance level task.
Right.
So the superintendent, the cabinet should be doing that work. The board should not be doing project management. The
Right.
board's version of monitoring progress should be about performance management. How are we doing relative to the goals? Management does their version of monitoring progress is project management. What is the fidelity of implementation of our
Right.
strategies?
Fidelity is a good word, a very good word, and a common one regarding implementation of various educational programs, because so many of them miss the path toward fidelity. Yeah. Also, something you suggested, uh, where the cart gets in front of the horse and the tail starts wagging the dog. You've suggested that people will find solutions in search of a problem. So they'll pick a solution first and then try to find a problem that the solution fits, where it really should go the other direction, where you should clearly identify what the problem is,
Yeah.
then go shopping for the product that might help you address
I
that
lead
problem.
a workshop, a multi-day workshop for education leaders. And so there'll be board members, there'll be cabinet members, there'll be superintendents, and so on and so
Mhm.
forth. And one of the activities I'll do is I'll ask them to identify a student outcome that's important to them. I'll have them up and walk to the flip chart paper with they and their partner, walk to the flip chart paper, identify a student outcome that's important to you, and identify the outputs and the inputs that are aligned to that.
Yep.
And so in this, in this concept, what there is to do is first think of what are the student outcomes, what are the results at the end of the cycle that we want. Then
Mhm.
we think of the outputs in the middle of the cycle to tell us whether or not we're on track to accomplish those. And then we think about what are the inputs that would actually help get those outputs that would actually help get us to the outcomes. But in the activity, I don't give those instructions. I just say pick a student outcome and then identify the outputs and inputs that are aligned to it. And invariably, what people do is they'll start by identifying an input that's really important. Okay, so we got to have quality teachers, and if we have quality teachers, then we'll have really great instruction. That's the output, and then student outcomes. And then third grade literacy will improve. Um, and so
Although
that,
that is important.
and I'm not suggesting that any of those pieces are unimportant. I am saying that their logic model is literally backwards,
Yeah.
and that the more effective strategy is to start with the end in mind. Think of what are the outcomes we want for students, What are the measures we could look at throughout the year to let us know if we're on track to accomplish those? And then what are the strategies and behaviors we could put in place for the adults that would move the needle on those output measures? But that is not the most common approach that I see during that activity.
Let me read a little bit from your bio in brief here. AJ is guided by his belief that student outcomes do not change until adult behaviors change. Elaborate on that in connection with what you just said about the workshops you've organized and conducted, and how persons thought through their logic chain in their thinking.
Yeah, this again goes back to my own experiences, coming up and really benefiting, from excellence in public education and just teachers who really leaned in. And what is apparent to me now is that there are no circumstances so insurmountable that we cannot serve a child. There are significant circumstances, to be certain. And many of the students I serve experience those circumstances on a daily basis that are confounds that challenge the system and legitimately make it more complicated to effectively serve children. But what my experience as a child and professionally has made very clear to me is that when adults are committed to what's possible for children, that we will change our behavior in whatever way is necessary, that the question becomes, who must I be such that little AJ, gets the instruction that he deserves? And when I come from that approach, this idea that what's possible for student outcomes emerges from my willingness to change my adult behavior, like anything becomes possible for these children. Conversely, when I wait for all the right circumstances, when we get the right parents, then we'll do something with little AJ. And when little AJ do something with his attitude, then we'll do something with little AJ. If little AJ wasn't broke, if his family actually had some money, then we could do something like this desire to allow the circumstances be more powerful than us, as caring members of the community. And so this is where this idea comes from. The student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change, starting with me.
Interesting. So then, from a board's perspective, what behaviors do they need to change in order to improve student outcomes?
Yeah, and so we started with the first behavior, which is just honoring that the only reason we exist is to improve student outcomes, and that all of our behaviors have to be in alignment with that. And so one of the things we'll do my workshops is we'll go through an activity that looks at recent agendas of the school board and begs the question, what alignment do you see between this agenda and what you all did with your time in this board meeting and the outcomes for students that you all claim are the most important? And invariably, we'll find very little alignment between what we say or the things we value and what we do. That there's this yawning chasm between what we say is most important and what our actions and use of time demonstrate is most important. And so a large part of my work is helping education leaders first notice that there is a gap between what I'm saying and what I'm doing, between who I claim to be and who I'm actually being. To first notice, become aware of that gap, acknowledge that I have the authority in my own life to span that gap, and then to begin to identify strategies to actually do so, to actually bring a sense of integrity between word and action, between saying and doing.
Well, that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you. A key word you said was awareness. So in the case of a school board for any district, are they aware, or would they be aware, that a behavioral change is required of them in order to improve student outcomes? It's almost
No,
not. It's almost as if it's more than a behavioral change. It's a conceptual change
no.
as well.
Unfortunately, no. So the challenge is that in much of the training that school board members receive, one, total miseducation of board members nationwide, in that the board members are frequently encouraged to engage in excuse making rather than to engage in responsibility taking. Like, what do I need to change in my own practice as a board member? And as I start to accept excuses for my lack of effectiveness as a board member, then I'm more likely to accept excuses from my chief executive, and then they're more likely to accept excuses from the principal. And so there's a complete breakdown, a sense of responsibility. Another way the board members are radically miseducated is that most trainings across the nation, most states don't require any specific training for school board members
Hmm.
outside of the training that's required of any elected officials in that state. And
Hmm.
so for most states, the only mandatory training that they actually receive as school board members
Hmm.
is just a series of things not to do to keep yourself out of jail. This is basically, here's how you don't wind up in a worse situation, but none of it is training on here's how you are blessing the children. Here's how you set children up for success. Here's how you create a school system that is pursuing this continuous improvement cycle that has its genesis in the boardroom and it inspires changes in practice in the classroom. None of that is on the menu. And so when you have people who the training is telling them, hey, watch your six, then we have adults focus on on the adult behaviors of folks around them, wondering, hey, what are you going to do to get me in trouble? Not what can I do that's going to actually improve student outcomes.
Okay.
There's an opportunity for adult behavior change in board members, but
Hmm.
it has to start with recognizing that for the most part, you have people who deeply care about what's possible for children, but have been radically miseducated about what boards can actually do, the actual power boards have to make a difference for students.
Well, AJ, we have around 3 minutes left. So let's talk about communicate results.
Yeah, because boards represent the vision and values of the community. So
Right.
first, they got to go to the community and listen for that vision and codify that in the form of goals. But then, after they've done that, they're going to spend time monitoring progress and aligning results, and either that's going to work out for children or it's not, regardless of whether it works or not. Because board members represent the vision and values of the community, they now have an obligation to go back to the community from whom they received the vision and communicate their results relative to the vision. This is an important closing of the loop
Hmm.
that a lot of school boards don't do, one, because they never adopted their own goals to begin with. In a lot of cases, the superintendent came up with a set of goals, and the board was like, yeah, that sounds good. In fact, I've had board members argue with me and say, well, no, we're on the board. We're not responsible for children learn. Like, that's not our job. Like, we're here for the taxpayers. It's like, no, my friend, you are here for one reason and one reason only. To ensure that there are constant improvements in student outcomes. And so, because that is the role of the board, they certainly have an obligation to go back to the community and report out how things are going, good, bad, or ugly. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't tiptoe around it. Be direct. Be clear with folks about what's working, what's not working.
Hmm. Wow. Many times in our conversation tonight, you've used the word loop. And you might be familiar with the problem solving method. Sometimes it's 7 steps, sometimes it's 8 steps. And the last step is always to restart, to go right back and do it. So, yes, I can see what you mean. That it's continuous improvement, as you said earlier. Well, AJ, we have a little bit of time left. What would be the takeaway from all the things we discussed that you would like people to have?
Student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change, starting with me. That within each of us, there is a capacity to take action in my own life right now that can move the needle on improving student outcomes, whether I'm a parent, whether I'm a teacher, whether I'm a principal, whether I'm a custodian, whether I'm a superintendent. And the thing to do is to look for that. And if you are looking and can't find it, shoot me an email. I'll gladly talk through
That's
it
good.
with you.
That's good. So then, you almost said your call to action. What's your call to action?
You know, the that's a great question. Yeah, I think the first thing that I would encourage folks to do is investigate what is a specific behavior in myself that's making it harder for students to be successful. And I promise you there is one. So I'm not asking if there's an example. Well, what I'm inviting you to do is really interrogate in my behaviors in the last month, what is an example of the behavior in my own life that may have made it harder for children in my community to be successful?
Mhm.
And once I've identified that, that is my passport to what is powerful for children. The moment I identify a behavior in myself that made it hard for children to be successful, now I've got my next step. Now I've got that next adult behavior that I can change that can give rise to improvements in student outcomes.
And if people want to know more, how do they contact you?
Hey, just hit me up over at ajcrabill.com or email me, aj@ajcrabill.com.
Uh-huh. Well, thank you for being our guest tonight. AJ Crabill serves as conservator at DeSoto Independent School District in DeSoto, Texas. I'm David Johnson of Transform Ed Consulting. And thanks once again to Cassandra Williams of Educational Innovation 360 Degrees for allowing us to use her channel. It's been great, and y'all have a wonderful evening. Thank you for being here with us tonight.